Fundraising always tells you how much money do the venture capital firms have in order to invest this money. So investment in the middle shows you how the investments are doing, and I added the 2014 numbers for you, even though we haven't closed the 2014 year, the statistics yet, but we are pretty optimistic that with regards to investments at least, we will reach 2013 numbers. 2013 we had about 3.5 billion euro invested, venture capital investments in Europe, just to give you that size. I will put that into perspective a bit later. Divestments, those are the numbers when venture capital firms are exiting their investments, and how much was exited on equity basis. And so this is also looks pretty stable, but you see a certain, on all respects, fundraising, investments, divestments, you see a certain decline. This chart puts things into relation. I just added what we did here with this chart. My colleagues from our research team, they just added the private equity investments on top of the venture capital ones, just to give you an impression how big private equity is. So everything that is investing in more mature companies, so not in the early startups, but in existing mature companies, that is a much bigger sector. Much more money is invested there because, of course, these companies that they're investing in are also bigger. But just to give you an idea, and you can also see that private equity, since the financial market crisis, has actually done better. So the numbers are up, especially 2013 was a very strong year. And but again, you see on the bottom in blue, this is venture capital, how much that is compared to private equity. And we as EVCA, we also represent the private equity industry of Europe. But all this is meaningless. You need to look at the underlying economy. You need to look at the country, you need to look at the region, and you need to look at the economy of that region if you want to put venture capital investments into perspective. And this is what we have done with this slide. So we are comparing the venture capital investments. We take that into relation to the GDP of a country. And then you see what kind of impact venture capital has within an economy. And the European average is the yellow pillar, and it's 0.024% of the whole European GDP is due to venture capital investments. And you see, so you can just get an idea that you see the US is clearly way ahead of us. And but look at Germany. I'm German, my home country is Germany. We are just about the European average. I would say Germany is a pretty strong economy. The economy is doing quite well. But with regards to VC, it's not the strongest economy. Even though I think the German example is a good example that you can also be very innovative without having a thriving VC industry. Because a lot of the innovation in Germany is happening in the German mid-market, in the famous Mittelstand. And those companies are working very closely together with German research institutes, like Fraunhofer or Max Planck Institute that you might have heard of. And so these mid-market companies, they're actually driving a lot of the innovation of the German ecosystem. And this is just because, I guess, Germany is not exactly a risk-taker country. And David talked about risk-taking being a very important element of having an entrepreneurial society and culture. And Germany is not really risk-taking, big in risk-taking. And so a lot of happens in the mid-market, which I think is also fine as long as the results are in order. We had so far in every presentation great slides about ecosystems. Here's another one. And I think we all agree that it needs much more than just a legal environment, that it needs more than just funding. Ecosystem is clearly important. You need innovative corporates because, big corporates also want to be part of this innovative ecosystem. And if you want to have successful venture capital ecosystem, you need platforms of exchange, I find. Venture capitalists want to connect all the time. So they want to go to conferences, they want to meet, they want to just discuss things Entrepreneurs want to meet, they want to discuss things, and they're very young actually. So you also need to keep in mind as a country, what can you offer the young people, the next generation? You know, they need cultural offerings. You know, they want to live somewhere where it's cool, and so it's not and something it's sometimes it just happens. So I do happen to come from Berlin. Which was announced already. And actually Berlin is experiencing to become one of these VC ecosystems, a cluster in Europe right now, which is quite surprising. It's a very recent development. And it's very much based on the fact that young people just think it's so cool to be in Berlin, where you have affordable living expenses, there are many, many universities. It's cool to be there, and so a lot of young people are attracted to this city. And if you have a lot of people there, you know, something is happening, and actually there's a lot of venture by now in Berlin, which is kind of amazing. But let me talk a bit about that bubble here that says a stable legal, a reliable legal environment, and also funding, because this is clearly something where the government can play a role to influence venture capital. And in Europe, we have a very, by now, mature regulatory environment. Why is the regulatory environment? It's not only important for the companies, the startups, it's not only important for the VC firms actually, it's very important for the investors in the asset class, venture capital. So ideally, of course, you have private investors in the asset class. You don't have that much public funding in a functioning market. You don't need public funding. And these investors invest for the long term. The classical venture capital fund lives for about 10 years. So investors do commit for 10 years into the fund. And they don't want any surprises from the regulatory side while they are invested with their money in funds. And so creating a stable legal environment, and I will not go to all the details on this EU regulation here, but it needs to be reliable, it needs to be stable. Long-term investors don't like surprises. And so that's important to keep in mind. And then, of course, you also want to put public funding into the system and the ecosystem. And the European Commission, the new EU President, Jean-Claude Juncker, a picture of him here, he wants to also boost again the European innovation system. He wants to boost SMEs, he wants to help them to become world leaders. And so they will put again money into the system, and I think venture capital will get also a fair share of that funding. But there is already a lot of public funding in venture capital in Europe. And this is a chart that shows you the amount of the different investor groups in venture capital. And the message of this slide is 40% of all the money that was being raised by venture capital firms last year comes from governments, institutions. 40%, that's a high amount. It has grown over time. And so why is that? Well, governments, as we said earlier, they like venture capital because it can a lot of good to the economy, and I think this is exactly the conclusion that also your country is now reaching. And if there aren't enough private investors who invest in the asset class, the government needs to jump in and needs to become an investor, which is not bad as such. However, I'm an economist, and I can tell you a market, free markets are always functioning best if they're mainly driven by private investors who are keen to generate high returns. So 40% of all the money in European venture capital is from the public funding side, and that again but it's not unusual. Believe me, US venture capital everywhere has a lot of public funding. And the role of this government funding is especially in the early seed sector. And I think the presentation of Dr. Turki just showed that very nicely, that also Saudi Arabia with Badir is investing mainly in the very early stages of a company, in incubators, in the tiny little firms that just start to develop business models and to grow. And so that's the same in Europe. Early stage funding is dominated by governments, which makes a lot of sense because there it's difficult, the private markets just don't function. And so you need public funding there. And I think the big challenge everywhere, and that's the same in Europe, but this will also be the big challenge here for Saudi Arabia, is what happens to all these tiny, very promising little companies, to take them to the next level, to find venture capital investors who are willing to take these to invest in these companies, and then take those companies yet to the next level where they will actually generate a positive cash flow. That's the main challenge. But not only for you. That's the same in Europe. And actually it's called the valley of death. If you have a lot of early stage seed financing, everything is working well, and then you have all these little companies, and then they're walking into this valley of death without any water and food, and a lot of them are dying actually. Because there's not enough venture capital around. So building up a meaningful venture capital ecosystem here in Saudi Arabia is just the right thing to do. And there's, I will skip this slide, maybe there's one piece of work that I would like to point you to. The OECD has done an extensive research on public funding schemes, venture capital all over the world in OECD countries. It shows what is working, what is not working. And I think the general message is really important. Always look at what you have at home. There is no perfect recipe that applies for all countries. I think you have to make a thorough analysis, and I think this is exactly what is happening here right now. What are your strengths? What are the strength of your economy? What is the culture of your economy? And then you have to find public funding schemes that align with the economy and with what you have at home. So different answers for different countries, and again, money is important, funding is important, but it's certainly not sufficient. It needs a lot more to build up a meaningful venture capital ecosystem, and I will be delighted to watch this and to follow this, and maybe come back again and to see what is happening. It's a very exciting project, and I do wish you the best of luck, and I'm sure you will succeed big time. Thank you so much for your attention.
Now we give you the chance for any questions. Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. Abdurrahman Al-Ali, Professor of International Business and Marketing at King Saud. Actually, I have two questions for Harper, if you can answer me. What's the average return on these investments after 2 years after starting up the incubation, after the funding, on average?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because the data actually is not very coherent in that respect, and there are different data sources, and we are only starting as an association to collect this performance data. I think venture capital is famous for being able to generate returns in the range of 25–30%, but this is why investors do like the asset class. However, it has shown over time that not every venture capital fund is able to generate such high returns. So you clearly, and to get 25% of one fund, you need to have at least one portfolio company, one startup company in your portfolio as a venture capital investor that makes it, through the ceiling, and that becomes a huge success, like the next Google, or the next Skype or Spotify, and so they'll also. So it differs, but 25–30% is the best what can be achieved for a venture capital fund. But to be very open and fair, not every fund is generating such high returns. Not every venture capital fund is successful.
Next request from Your Highness and Khalid. Next week, I'll start my MBA class. I have 3 classes. So I'll send a team of my MBA students to study what my colleague David Teese mentioned, to study the failures. So if you allow my students to come and get your data, and to become a confidential report, you can allow them whatever you want them to publish, and not to publish the others, fine. So this for academic purposes. So I'll send a team. If you allow me, I will do that.
you and your team are welcome, and we'll show you everything. In fact, we have to show the failures, and as was mentioned by Professor Thies earlier, that should not be a stigma. You know, failure should be a plus, and we have to change the culture. This is one of the acculturations that have to take place in the kingdom, and we hope to help change that. Failure, if it is a good failure, as was mentioned, if it is something that you take it as an experience, you learn things that lead to failure, so you will avoid them. But actually, many venture capitalists are proud that they have failed and succeeded, so they know what it takes to fail. So, in fact, you know, they're all welcome, and we will show them what they want.
One case that was funded by Bader, which is Yatug, Latif al-Wa'lan's project. Actually, I finished a case with one of my PhD students, and we got a release from her to publish it. So that was a success. So I'd like to take the lesson to be learned from other failures for the sake of our students. Thank you very much.
Question for Ms. Hapner. My name is Khalid Suleimani. I'm the head of Al-Khabir Ventures and Serb Angels. There's been a lot going on in terms of funding in the past couple of years, and I was in the middle of two initiatives. One of them is sponsored by Bader here, which is the Serb Angel Group, and also a micro VC or a VC for Series A funding. However, most of the startups that come to us are not even in that stage. So we have a gap within the gap. We tried to fill the gap with the Series A funding and the Angel Group, but we have a gap within the gap between the accelerator and incubator